All right, welcome everybody. I've never used this before, so this will be kind of new and exciting for me. Um, Once in a while, I like to do these PowerPoints on my own, and I'm not as exciting as the others that you've probably seen, but this is my first crack at it with this kind of system, so we'll see how it goes. So our video notes today are on Chapter 3, the settling the northern colonies from 1619 to 1700. And let's get going. All right, so to understand the settling of the northern colonies, we have to go all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, early 1500s, 1517. Martin Luther, a man who's going to a priest who is going to change rock Europe for the next several hundred years, at least his ideas, not him himself. That'd be kind of weird. Um, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, and his ideas were that the Bible alone was the source of God's word, not the Bible or the church or the Pope. People are saved simply by faith and not having to go and repent, telling the priest all of your sins. And his actions would ignite an entire Protestant Reformation. I'm sure you remember from world history, not just Lutheranism, but different branches of Christianity. And some of those branches we're going to take a look at. John Calvin is Swedish, but he would have an influence all across Europe as well. His style, I shouldn't say style, his belief would be known as Calvinism, which he definitely preached predestination. This is kind of tough to understand, but the followers in Calvinism believe that God is an all-knowing God, and he's good. So God is all-knowing, God is good. Humans are wicked, and we're born with original sin. His basic doctrines were stated in a 1536 document entitled Institutes of the Christian Religion. And like we said, stated all humans were weak and wicked. Here's the kicker. God knows who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. It was predetermined, predestination, no matter what. I mean, you could be an evil person and still go to heaven, although we'll get into what the Calvinists believe. Calvinists were expected to seek conversions, signs that they were the ones that were predestined, and go through this complete religious experience. They called them in the Puritan religion, the Puritans were Calvinists, and we'll get to that in a second, but they called them the visible saints. And then from there on, after this conversion experience, they would lead good, sanctified lives. Calvinists were famous for working extremely hard from dusk to dawn to prove their worthiness to God. And the impact of Calvinism has been vividly stamped on the psyche of Americans, and ever since has been called the Protestant work ethic. Remember in the beginning of class last week, we had talked about the Puritans and how the Puritans have left kind of the psyche on the United States, set the foundation. Here again, you see with the influence of Calvinism and this belief in predestination grows what was called it has been dubbed the Puritan work ethic. Specifically, take a look at England, so Henry VIII and that hot mess in England. Again, going back to the 1530s, I'm sure you learned about King Henry VIII in world history, but he was all about breaking the ties with the Roman Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce from his first wife, Queen Catherine, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope wasn't having it because of the strong Catholicism ties to Spain, where Catherine came from. So after that split from the Roman Catholic Church, Henry VIII became head of the Church of England. So essentially they kept all of the Roman Catholic practices. Nothing really changed except Henry VIII was the head of the church. And they wanted everybody throughout England in the different districts, not just in London, but everywhere in England, to swear an oath that they would be accepting of this new religion, the Church of England, which here's where we see the kind of the infiltration of different Protestant ideas, Lutheranism, Calvinism, coming in. And Baptists and Puritans and were all affected by the beliefs of John Calvin. So you have to think of this umbrella, Calvinism. Underneath this umbrella would be Puritanism, Baptists, and so on and so forth. So the Puritans were very accepting of the idea of getting rid of the Roman Catholic practices. Some people wanted, there are some like hardcore Puritans, and then there are some not so hardcore Puritans, and we're going to get into that in a second. But the Puritans, you have to think of the root word pure. They wanted to purify the Church of England of all of its Roman Catholic rituals. They, and some went so far as to completely, wanting to separate from the Church of England, and that's where they're causing a little bit of trouble in England. But they believe that only visible saints should be admitted into the church. Instead, Henry VIII wanted all of his citizens to take an oath to be welcomed into the Church of England, and the purest of the Puritans didn't really like that idea. They felt that only the visible saints, those who had gone through the conversion, should be welcomed into church. And so you have this group of hardcore Puritans who became known as the Separatists, and they vowed to break away from the Church of England. The Church of England is also called the Anglican Church in North America. King James I, father of the beheaded Charles I, later on would harass the Separatists out of England because he thought that if people could defy him as their spiritual leader, they might defy him as their political leader as well. And so a group of separatists eventually found themselves in the Netherlands, where they never really felt comfortable. So they wanted to lead rich English lives, and they felt that they weren't welcome in the Netherlands either. So what the Puritans, these separatists, did is they struck a deal with the Virginia Company, and they were supposed to land in Virginia. Well, that did not happen. Well, anyway, in 1620, they set out. It was on the ship the Mayflower, and all of these people are pilgrims. They're considered pilgrims, but not all pilgrims are separatists. There's a very actually small amount of separatists, these Puritans, hardcore that were on the Mayflower. The pilgrims got off course, and instead of landing in Virginia, they landed in the north. And it's generation to generation, it's been in the American psyche, this idea that they've landed at Plymouth Rock, and lights were shining and angels were singing and everything else, but that's not the way it was. They sent people ahead, to check out the land first, and they agreed that they would land near what we know today as Boston, Massachusetts. They were technically squatters. Squatters are people who decide to live on the land without actually having any legal rights to it. So they only struck a deal with the Virginia Company and not anywhere else. So they were actually illegally there in the first place. So it's kind of interesting. Aboard the ship, they did sign a very impactful agreement. It would influence us later down the road, but it was just a simple agreement to form a crude, loose government and to submit to the will of the majority under regulations agreed upon. So little seeds of democracy were planted with the Mayflower Compact, and that's why it's so important. It's not that it was a huge document or a constitution, but it was this agreement that they would submit to the will of the majority. They had a really rough go in the early part of 1620. They started figuring things out in the fall of 1621, and in the fall of 1621, they celebrated the first Thanksgiving, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in this group, William Bradford, the founders of Plymouth Rock, William Bradford was elected 30 times as governor. He is a very well-educated man, and Plymouth colony never really grew all that much. I mean, it was just a small, really hardcore group of Puritans who, they had successful fishing industry and all that, but they were really focused on their religion, and not a lot of people were very hardcore. And I keep saying that phrase over and over. I mean, these people were very, very devout and hardcore. So by 1691, I mean, you're talking, what, 70 years? Only 7,000 people were in this colony. And eventually Plymouth Rock would merge with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Bay Colony, otherwise known as the Bible Commonwealth. Kids tend to kind of mush these two together. They think Massachusetts Bay is Plymouth Rock, but they were two very separate colonies that had started off. So the Plymouth Rock colony, they were squatters. They really had no legal rights to the land. The Bay Colony is a little bit different. So in 1629, so in our timeline, we're talking 8 years later, some non-separatist Puritans, so they're more the moderate Puritans, got a royal charter. So they got an actual approval from the king to settle in the New World, unlike the separatists who worked with the Virginia Company instead. Secretly, they took the charter with them and later used it as a type of constitution to set up their colony. It was well equipped, a group of 11 ships that carried about 1,000 people to Massachusetts, their families, young, old. John Winthrop was elected governor or deputy governor for 19 years in this colony as well, helping Massachusetts prosper in fur trading, fishing, shipbuilding. So this was a very successful colony. And let's see. A little bit more about John Winthrop. He had this vision. He was also a deeply religious man. He had this vision that their colony would be the beacon to the rest of the world. The rest of the world should emulate what they're doing here, that they had a contract, a covenant with God to build a holy city. And he said, we shall be as a city upon a hill. And he was talking about Boston. And the establishment of this colony, the way they set up their government, was pretty interesting as well. All adult white males who were free, because you got to remember there were indentured servants also coming over to the New World who were either sentenced or jails were overflowing at this time in England and they had to pay off their debt or whatever, legal trouble. They weren't technically free. So all adult white males who were free and who belonged to the church, known as the Congregational Church, would actually take part in government. So we talk about the franchise, the right to vote was extended to all freemen, adult white males who belonged to the Puritan congregations, later called the Congregational Church. So the Puritan Church was known as the Congregational Church. The Church of England in North America is known as the Anglican Church. Also, later on, would be called the Episcopal Church. So about 2/5 of adult white free males took part in provincial elections. Let's see, in town governments, white male property owners and other residents, so you're talking about smaller towns, in some cases were able to partake in the majority rule. So you're seeing again here in the Bay Colony government also the seeds of democracy being planted. Only visible saints again were considered freemen, part of the church. And the purpose of government was to enforce God's law. So that's something that's very different from what we have today with the separation of church and state. And even non-believers had to pay a tax to the church. So the provincial government, you have to keep in mind, was not a true democracy. Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the common people, calling democracy the meanest and worst of all forms of government. Religious leaders wielded powerful influence over the admission to church membership. John Cotton, a prominent clergy member, was educated at Cambridge and immigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. One interesting thing that the congregation could hire church members of the church and also their governors. They could withhold pay. So the congregation could withhold salary, hire, they could fire. So the congregation had a lot of power, and that will be important later on. So there are still laws to limit earthly pleasures, such as a fine of 20 shillings for couples caught kissing in public. There was an example given in the book. And the Puritan concept of hell was very serious, frightening, and very real. Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom, written in 1662, sold 1 copy for every 20 people. So life was serious business. You had to definitely earn your keep. You had to work hard. Hellfire was definitely a real thing. But the Bay Colony prospered. There was a lot of social harmony. However, you're never going to have a utopian society. Dissenters did come, and the Quakers came. There was another religious group that they fled Europe and came over, and we'll talk about them in a second. But women like Anne Hutchinson, and then a man like Roger Williams, so they eye to eye. So tensions arose in Massachusetts. Quakers were fined, they were flogged, in some cases they were banished out of the colony. And I thought I talked about Anne Hutchinson. Oh shoot, no, I can't go back. Okay, well, I guess just listen to what I say here, and thought we could go back, but I guess we can't. All right, so Anne Hutchinson, we're going to talk a little bit about her in class, and I've got a video and stuff that we're going to talk about. But Anne was a very intelligent, outspoken woman. She was very strong-willed. She had a lot of kids, I think 13. And she said that to truly be saved, you need not bother to obey the law of either God or man. And this was known as, I can never say this, antinomianism. She was brought to trial in 1638, and she boasted that her beliefs were directly from God. I mean, this is something that Puritan women did not do, or at least admit to doing, was talking directly to God. Only Puritan ministers could do that. She was banished from the colony and eventually made her way to Rhode Island. We'll talk about Rogues Island here in a second. She died in New York after an attack by Native Americans there. Roger Williams is the other dissenter that's pretty well known. So let me go back to Anne Hutchinson for a second. I'm going to probably talk about this in class. Is that she is also one of the first, women that we studied that was not afraid to stand up for her beliefs and kind of set the precedent there. Okay, so Roger Williams, he was also part of the Bay Colony and was a radical idealist, very faithful man. But he hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean and complete break of the Church of England. And he wanted complete separation from the Church of England, wanted to completely purify it. But he had some radical beliefs. He went on to deny that civil government could and should be governed by religious behavior. He didn't believe in a tax by non-believers to support a church. And he was very outspoken on these ideas. He also didn't believe that the land should be taken from, in many cases, and fought for against the Native Americans. He felt that the Native Americans should be justly paid. And so he was banished in 1635, and he led the way for the Rhode Island colony, also known as the Seward Colony or Rogues Island. People who went to Rhode Island weren't necessarily similar, they were just unwanted anywhere else. So that's why the name became Rogues Island. They were against special privilege. Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. And finally, it secured a charter in 1644. So good, maybe it's about 15 years after John Winthrop began his city on the hill in the Bay Colony. And they welcomed all kinds of people there, Quakers, Jews, Catholics. And Roger Williams would start the first Baptist church in Rhode Island. Okay, so now we get to the slide. New England spreads out, and in 1636, Puritans began to move out of the Bay Colony towards Connecticut. And in 1639, 3 years later, the first form of government, the Fundamental Orders, would be drafted. And it was basically their modern constitution. When the colonies would form, it was their state constitution. When we fought for independence, it would become, a lot of the ideas would be embedded in their state constitution. And in 1638, New Haven, Connecticut was founded and eventually merged into Connecticut. In 1623, we have Maine, a lot of fishing villages, shipbuilding industries, would be absorbed by Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you have to imagine Massachusetts Bay as being this huge area right here, and would remain for nearly a century and a half. And we'll talk later about how Maine would become a state. 1641, the granite-ribbed New Hampshire was absorbed into Massachusetts. So this whole thing was Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in 1679, the king separated the two and made New Hampshire a royal colony. We'll talk about the difference between a proprietary colony and a royal colony in class. One rule of thumb to kind of keep in mind is that all earlier colonies grew into the Bay Colony, all later colonies grew out of the Bay Colony as it spread out. So we're going to spend a great deal of time talking about the relationship with the Puritans versus the Indians. 1621, Chief Massasoit signed a treaty with Plymouth Puritans, and that's where we read about the first Thanksgiving. Well, his son would later get into some trouble with the Puritans. In 1637, the Massacre at Mystic, this is in Connecticut, when the Puritans start spreading out. They set the precedent for further Puritans, for further immigrants to keep taking and taking and taking the land. The Pequot War would break out, and it ushered in about 4 decades of uneasiness between natives and Puritans, where at that first Thanksgiving under Massasoit, they had a general understanding. The Puritans weren't so concerned with building a relationship with the natives. They're more about getting them out of the way and going to war. But we did see along the way some praying towns set up, and that was set up to convert the Native Americans. Eventually, King Philip's War in 1675, so this is Metacom, called King Philip by the English. And you're going to see this as one of the themes too throughout early history, is that Native Americans tried to band together. And Metacom, who was Chief Massasoit's son, was successful at gaining allies with other Native American tribes, but eventually the English would win out. And one kind of gruesome fact was that King Philip's War, although it did slow colonial western march, Metacom was beheaded, quartered, and his head was stuck on a sharp pike for all to see. His wife and son were sold into slavery, and his head was on that pike for years as a warning. So King Philip's War would really be the lasting defeat of the natives in the Northeast. All right, so we have to talk about colonial unity. There was not a whole lot, but each member in the New England Confederation, now this was set up on their own without the king involved. It was like a Puritan club. It was the Bay and Plymouth colonies, New Haven, where some of the Puritans went, and Valley settlements. The king early on had paid little attention to them. They were treated more like commonwealths, so they were very independent, and they were allowed to set up their own form of government, loosely based on what they'd known in England. This confederation, the Puritan Club, each member colony had 2 votes regardless of size, so that made Massachusetts Bay Colony kind of mad. But they kind of did their own thing up until the 1660s, when Charles II was restored after the Civil War in England, because it was really during the Civil War that the colonies were able to hang out and do their own thing. But when Charles II came back, or was restored to the throne, the relationship changed and it kind of tightened. The Bay Colony had its charter revoked in 1684. Boston, the Bay Colony, Boston especially, they're the rebel, the colony, and they, as a punishment, in 1684 had its charter, oops, I spelled that wrong, revoked in 1684. So really setting the precedent for later. So now the king is tightening the strings, and the first American Revolution really would be born in the late 1600s in what was called the Dominion of New England. So this was established by the Crown in 1686. It was imposed from London, and they brought in neighboring colonies like New York and New Jersey. So it wasn't only the Puritan Club anymore. And one of the biggest restrictions was the enforcement of the navigation laws. These are going to be huge. The colonies are not allowed to trade with any other country but Great Britain. And so this economic system, this mercantilist type of economic system, really hurts business with the colonies and other countries besides England. Edmund Andros, this guy here, is the leader and is definitely hated. He's the leader of the Dominion of New England by the king. All right, now fast forward. Glorious Revolution. You probably learned about this in world history. William of Orange and Mary would come to power in a bloodless revolution, and they relaxed the laws a little bit. So they began a period, and I want you to know this term, of salutary neglect. They let the colonies do their own thing again, and the navigation laws, although still there, were really weakly enforced. Still, English officials were present in many ways in the colonies. It wasn't abandoned, but they did loosen up. So New Netherlands. Okay, so Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch, sails down the Hudson River. Today is known as Hudson River in New York. And really this was an area for trading and commercial center. That's really what the purpose was, established by the Dutch West India Company, which was not as fruitful or successful as the Dutch East India Company, and it was mainly established for fur trade. The Dutch did something kind of unprecedented. Manhattan was bought by the company for pennies per acre, and I don't know if the natives knew what they were agreeing to, but nonetheless, it was sold. New Amsterdam was created, later would be known as New York, and it was a company town. There were a lot of immigrants that were coming to New Amsterdam, although the company owners weren't really too interested in liberty and equality, but nonetheless, this was the stopping point for many immigrants. And today, that precedent was definitely set. New York City would eventually become a city. And a lot of Dutch influence was, and still is, and was felt in this region and in North America as a whole. All right, Dutch influence. The English, as they grew more in size and power, the Dutch were just kind of in the way. And the English regarded them as intruders. They would force the Dutch to surrender, even though Pieter Stuyvesant was very brave. He ended up surrendering New Amsterdam to the British. And so New Amsterdam was then named New York. But the Dutch influence can still be felt in many different ways, and one of those ways is, I believe, the waffle, Christmas trees, I think there's something to do with Christmas, Santa Claus, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, golf, city names like Harlem were established, never left. Now moving to Pennsylvania, so we're now getting into the middle colonies. Penn's Holy Experiment, William Penn. He got a royal charter mid-1600s. The king actually owed his father a great deal of debt, so this was the way to repay the family back. And so William Penn, a lot of liberal ideas with this guy, man. He wanted to, so he was given a proprietary grant. So a proprietary colony is a colony that's established by somebody who has a lot of money, and they're basically in charge of the colony. A royal colony established by the king, and the king oversees that colony. So William Penn is a proprietor. He managed to secure an immense grant of fertile land from the king. It was called Pennsylvania in honor of him, and it was one of the best advertised colonies. I mean, he really did a good job of marketing and reaching out to all kinds of people. And so William Penn was a deeply religious man. He was a Quaker. The Quakers were also known as the Religious Society of Friends. Philadelphia, the city, was so planned out. thousands of squatters already lived in Pennsylvania anyway, so they were illegally there. It was more carefully planned than most cities, beautiful wide streets. Penn also, he bought the land from Indians, and yeah, we're going to talk about that. And he bought the land, a lot of land from Chief Tammany. Later, Tammany Hall, the patron saint of the government, he'll talk about later. His treatment of the Indians was so gentle that Quakers could walk through Indian territory unharmed without being hurt or fear of being hurt. But that was kind of its undoing as well, because these liberal ideas, bringing in anybody and everybody, Jews, Catholics, Quakers, Puritans, Dutch, Swedish, English wealth, their tolerance is really the undoing of native policy, because a lot of these people that were not Quakers were very against the Native Americans. Quakers also developed a dislike towards slavery, and one of the first groups to be very outspoken, and began abolition of slavery, to advocate for abolition of slavery. Let's see. So the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. This was known as the breadbasket, very fertile soil. Delaware was settled by the Dutch, named after Governor Delaware. New Jersey was a royal colony, established in 1702. They had abundance of rivers. There's also good fur trade, shipbuilding, forests. More ethnically, the middle colonies were definitely more ethnically mixed, religious toleration, democratic control. One of famous middle colonial men was Benjamin Franklin. He was born in Boston in the Bay Colony, but he entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm, and immediately found a congenial home in the urbane, open atmosphere of the city. He said he really came alive, really was born at the age of 17 when he moved to Philadelphia. He didn't know himself prior to that, I guess, like Philadelphia was for him. So yeah, I mean, here you got a little background of the northern colonies and some of our major players, who the Puritans were. I mean, we're going to spend a lot of time in class discussing that. And then a little bit more about the middle colonies as well, being the most ethnically diverse. On the AP exam, on my exams, the big ideas that you want to take away from chapters 2 and 3 is basically the differences in the colonies, how they were set up, their economies, how they're different. I mean, you've got 13, but really you read on your reading guide, it's really not 13 colonies that sprang up that were very diverse, different, not united from one another. So that's really the idea that we want to pay special attention to. All right, I'm done. That's a long PowerPoint. I'll try to shorten them up in the future, but I can ramble on and on. So thanks for paying attention, and we'll talk to you soon.